It started the very week I moved into my quiet cabin retreat. What was supposed to be my escape from the chaos of city life turned into something far worse. I hadn't even unpacked my boxes when the HOA stormed onto my property, bold as ever, pointing fingers and demanding things that weren't theirs to claim. They weren't just nitpicking about fences or lawn height. They came after my land, insisting I had no right to it. Strangers, acting like they owned me, my cabin, and my future. But what they didn't know was that the ground beneath their feet wasn't theirs to control. How far would they push before learning the truth? When I first decided to move into the cabin, it wasn't about luxury or prestige. It was about peace. After years of grinding through long hours in the city, surrounded by the constant hum of traffic and the endless churn of deadlines, I wanted nothing more than a quiet retreat where I could breathe. The cabin seemed perfect, tucked neatly against a backdrop of towering pines, with a gravel driveway that curved just enough to give me a sense of privacy, but not isolation. It wasn't some grand estate. It was simple, sturdy, and mine. I imagined mornings with a cup of coffee on the porch, the distant sound of birds replacing honking horns, and evenings watching the sun sink behind the trees instead of into concrete. It was supposed to be the first place in years where I could finally exhale. The first few days were exactly what I had dreamed of. I unpacked boxes slowly, no rush, and left stacks of them near the door while I focused on the essentials. Setting up my little kitchen, bringing life to the fireplace, and arranging the worn but comfortable furniture I had carried with me for years. I found myself waking up earlier, not out of obligation, but out of excitement to see the fog lifting off the tree line. My neighbors, scattered across the community, weren't close enough to see into my windows. Still, they were close enough to wave at when driving past. At first glance, it seemed like the kind of neighborhood where people minded their own business. That illusion, I would soon learn, could not have been more wrong. The cabin came with a story. Decades ago, it was part of a larger tract of land that was split and sold off in pieces. What I owned was not just the structure itself, but a stretch of property that dipped beyond the visible tree line. It wasn't something I gave much thought to when I signed the paperwork. Land was land, and as far as I was concerned, the value was in having space, not in staking a claim against anyone else. Still, I remember the realtor emphasizing, almost with a wink, that what lay beneath the soil carried more weight in the community than I might realize. I brushed it off at the time, too focused on imagining my new life to notice the undertone in her voice. On my first weekend there, I began to get a sense of the place's rhythm. Trucks drove by more often than cars. Some residents worked outdoors, hauling lumber or tinkering with equipment in their driveways. Others, mostly older, kept their yards so meticulously groomed that it looked as if they were preparing for inspections. A few friendly faces waved when I stopped at the local store for groceries. Still, others eyed me with a kind of cautious curiosity, as if they were already measuring me against some invisible standard. That was my first subtle glimpse into how tightly held appearances seemed to be here. I settled in quickly. I stacked firewood along the side of the house, planted a few small shrubs by the porch, and cleared out an old shed that the last owner had clearly neglected. Every evening, I would sit outside with the sounds of crickets echoing through the trees, feeling certain I had made the right choice. But every time I drove through the neighborhood, I noticed signs. Not street signs, but ones posted on fences and gates, notices about regulations, reminders about property boundaries, bolded lists of rules attached to lampposts. At first, I didn't pay them much attention. Every community had guidelines, right? That's just how neighborhoods operated. But the more I noticed, the more I realized that rules weren't just guidelines here. They were the backbone of how this place seemed to function. By the end of that first week, I received my welcome packet. A thick envelope stuffed with paperwork slid under my door without a knock or greeting. Inside was a neatly typed letter from the Homeowners Association, stamped with an official-looking seal. It was filled with page after page of rules. What colors houses could be painted, what vehicles could be parked in driveways, and even how tall the grass was allowed to grow before a violation would be issued. Buried halfway through the packet was a map of the community with shaded areas, marked as common land. That was the first moment I noticed something unsettling. Parts of my property overlapped with those shaded areas. According to their map, the very land I had just bought wasn't entirely mine at all. It was shared. I didn't panic, at least not right away. I chalked it up to a clerical mistake, a misprint. Surely the paperwork I had signed, notarized, and closed on carried more weight than a photocopied map in a welcome packet. But the thought lingered in the back of my mind, a small splinter I couldn't quite ignore. Still, I tried to brush it off and return to my routine. I explored the local trails, visited a nearby lake, and even had a brief conversation with a neighbor who mentioned, almost offhandedly, that the HOA was strict but fair. His tone didn't sound convincing, more like someone repeating a line they had been forced to memorize. It wasn't a warning, but it wasn't a reassurance either. As I grew more comfortable in the cabin, I began to notice small details that seemed out of place. Cars I didn't recognize were idling near the edge of my driveway. Notes pinned to my door, unsigned, reminding me of community standards. The first time I saw a group of board members walking past my cabin, clipboards in hand, I assumed they were surveying the area. But the way their eyes lingered on my property line, the way they whispered to each other as they pointed at the trees, it didn't feel casual. It felt deliberate. For the moment, I ignored it. I told myself I was overthinking. But somewhere deep down, I already sensed the truth. This wasn't a community that welcomed me. This was a community that measured me. And the very land I was standing on, the land I thought would be my refuge, was about to become the battleground they had been waiting for. The first time the HOA came after me, it was almost laughable. A single notice, printed on cheap paper, slipped under my door with no explanation beyond a list of infractions. According to them, my firewood stack was improper storage of materials. The few moving boxes I had leaned against the porch were called unsightly debris. Even the grass at the edge of the tree line, which hadn't been touched since before I owned the cabin, was deemed out of compliance. Each so-called violation came with a fine neatly itemized at the bottom. $50 here, $75 there, $100 for the grass. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. Surely someone had confused my cabin with another property. Or maybe they were just being overzealous, and this was their standard way of welcoming new residents. But then another notice came. This one claimed my porch light wasn't an approved model under their guidelines. A few days later, I was fined for my mailbox, apparently too tall by a few inches compared to their community standards. It became clear this wasn't an accident. They weren't just nitpicking details, they were hunting for them. Every new letter seemed more absurd than the last, but each carried the same unshakable undertone. Comply, pay, submit. The pace of the notices was relentless. In less than 3 weeks, I had been fined more than half a dozen times. My mailbox became a revolving door of threats and demands. The totals began stacking up into hundreds of dollars, even before I had fully unpacked my belongings. It didn't end with paper. I started noticing them, board members, appearing near my property. At first, it was casual. Someone with a clipboard is standing at the end of my driveway, pretending to check something on the road. Then, 2 or 3 of them clustered together, across the street, whispering, pointing, scribbling notes while glancing in my direction. It wasn't paranoia, they wanted me to see them. Everywhere I turned, their presence seemed to follow. I would be outside splitting wood, and a car I didn't recognize would idle at the edge of the road, engine running, driver staring straight ahead. When I drove into town, I caught sight of familiar faces, the same HOA members walking the aisles. of the hardware store, lingering too long near me, as if to remind me they were never far away. Then came the warnings. Notes taped to my door, unsigned but typed with the same rigid language as the violation letters. Community standards must be upheld. Your cooperation is expected. One even read, failure to comply will result in further enforcement. No signature, no explanation, just threats slipped onto my property like calling cards. I tried to brush it off, to convince myself it was just overzealous bureaucracy. But the more I ignored it, the bolder they became. One morning, I stepped outside to find my garbage cans tipped over, their contents scattered across the driveway. At first, I thought it might have been raccoons, but the cans were neatly rolled into the ditch, as if placed there on purpose. Another time, I found spray paint across the side of my mailbox. The words were sloppy, but the message was clear enough. Community rules. The harassment wasn't random, it was orchestrated. And always, behind it all, was the HOA. Still, I wasn't ready to bend. I paid none of their fines. Instead, I gathered my paperwork, copies of my deed, and property maps. I highlighted every boundary, every line that proved the land was mine. When the following violation notice arrived, claiming my property extended into a shared community space, I responded with the proof. I told them firmly in writing that their claims were wrong. For a moment, I thought that would be enough. Surely they couldn't argue with official documents. But a week later, another envelope appeared. Not an apology, not an acknowledgement, just a new fine, this one for non-compliance with boundary adjustment. They had taken my proof, ignored it entirely, and twisted it into yet another charge. It was becoming clear. This wasn't about rules. It wasn't about standards, lights, or mailboxes. This was about control. They weren't interested in facts. They were interested in breaking me down, one notice, one fine, one threat at a time. And as the pressure mounted, I realized something chilling. If this were only the beginning, what would they do next? The harassment shifted from paper threats to something more personal. One Saturday morning, I heard voices outside. When I stepped onto the porch, 3 HOA board members were standing in my yard, clipboards in hand, pointing at my cabin like inspectors surveying condemned property. They didn't knock, didn't announce themselves. They walked onto my land as if it were theirs. One of them, a tall man with a stiff posture, held up a thick folder. This structure, he said flatly, sits partially on community-managed land. You'll need to take corrective action. I stared at him, stunned. Corrective action? Removal or reassignment, he replied, flipping through his pages without looking me in the eye. The words hit like a hammer. Removal. Reassignment. They weren't talking about firewood or porch lights anymore. They were talking about my cabin, the home I had just bought. I told them they were trespassing, that they had no right to walk onto my property and make demands. They didn't flinch. Only when I raised my voice and threatened to call the sheriff did they finally leave, muttering about further enforcement as they disappeared down the road. The silence afterward was almost worse. No new letters came for days, no notices, no cars idling near the driveway. For a brief moment, I thought I had scared them off, but the quiet turned out to be nothing more than the calm before the storm. A week later, a certified letter arrived by mail. Unlike the usual flimsy violation slips, this one carried weight, stamped, signed, and filed as an official complaint. The HOA had taken its accusations to the county. According to them, I was illegally occupying land that belonged to the community. They cited my refusal to pay fines, my defiance of boundary adjustments, and even included photographs, snapped from God knows where, of my cabin and property lines. The letter ended with a line that made my stomach drop. Failure to resolve. This matter may result in legal action, including but not limited to eviction. Eviction. from land I owned. The absurdity of it made me furious, but beneath the anger was a gnawing unease. I had heard of HOAs being aggressive, but this was something else. They weren't bluffing. They were escalating. As if to drive the point home, the petty vandalism returned. My trash cans were overturned again, this time smashed so hard that one of the lids cracked. I found tire tracks carved into the gravel at the edge of my property, deep grooves where a vehicle had spun out in the night. And once, late in the evening, I caught a glimpse of two figures standing just beyond the tree line, watching silently before they vanished into the darkness. I started documenting everything. Photos of the notices, the vandalism, even the tire marks. I kept a journal, recording dates, times, and every detail I could think of. If they wanted a fight, I was going to be ready. But the more evidence I collected, the heavier the weight became. It wasn't just about defending property anymore. It was about protecting myself from people who clearly thought intimidation was a legitimate tactic. I spoke to a few neighbors, hoping someone might shed light on what was happening. Most avoided the subject, their smiles stiff and their words clipped. But one older man, after glancing around to make sure no one was listening, muttered quietly, "They'll bleed you dry if you let them. They don't stop. They push until you give in." Then he walked away without another word. It chilled me more than the notices ever could. Because it wasn't just my battle. It was the culture of the entire neighborhood. People here lived under fear, nodding along to whatever the board decided, too afraid to resist. I wasn't ready to surrender, but the pressure was mounting. Each day felt like a countdown, each shadow outside a reminder that I was being tested. And the certified letter wasn't an empty threat. It was a promise. They wanted to take me to court. They wanted to prove I didn't belong here. They wanted me gone. However, they didn't realize that they had already overstepped. In their arrogance, they had overlooked the one truth that would shatter their case entirely. The pressure became suffocating. Every day I checked the mailbox with a knot in my stomach, never knowing what fresh accusation would be waiting. The certified letter hadn't been a bluff. A follow-up arrived 2 weeks later, this one even more aggressive. It declared that my continued occupation of community land was a direct violation of bylaws and demanded that I vacate or face immediate legal remedies. Vacate. They were no longer talking about fines or adjustments. They were ordering me to abandon my cabin, my home, because they decided it was theirs to control. The absurdity of it all was almost too much to process, but that didn't make the threat any less real. I pictured sheriffs arriving one morning, eviction papers in hand. At the same time, the board members watched with smug satisfaction from across the street. I imagined them tearing down my cabin, erasing every trace of my presence, rewriting history as if I had never existed here. The harassment in person grew bolder. I would wake up to find HOA members standing just beyond the boundary of my yard, pretending to be inspecting common land. At the same time, their eyes lingered on my cabin. Once I returned from town to find an orange construction stake driven into the ground at the edge of my driveway. On it was a handwritten note. Property line adjustment pending. It wasn't official. It wasn't legal. It was psychological warfare, designed to make me second-guess myself, to wonder if, maybe, somehow, they were right. But I knew the truth. I had the deed. I had the maps. The land was mine. Still, even with proof in my hands, the constant siege began to wear me down. Nights became restless. Every creak of the cabin made me wonder if someone was outside, circling in the dark. Every vehicle that slowed near my driveway sent my heart racing. Even inside my own home, I felt hunted. The financial strain added to the weight. Although I refused to pay their bogus fines, the totals continued to pile up in their letters. Each one declared me delinquent, adding late fees and threatening liens. The numbers ballooned into the thousands. Fictional debts, they insisted, were real. I imagined what they must be telling the community, that I was a troublemaker, a rule breaker, someone who thought he was above the standards everyone else followed. They were painting me as the villain, and I couldn't fight a rumor whispered behind closed doors. Then came the most chilling blow yet. Another certified letter, this one notifying me of a scheduled hearing. The board intended to present its case before the county, arguing that my property overlapped with community-managed land and that I had refused all reasonable accommodations. Their wording dripped with self-righteousness, as if they were the guardians of order and I was the intruder who needed to be expelled. The date was set. I had weeks to prepare, weeks to gather my documents, to steel myself for a battle I hadn't asked for but could no longer avoid. The tension reached its peak one night when I heard footsteps outside the cabin. Slow, deliberate, crunching on the gravel near the shed. I grabbed a flashlight and stormed outside, only to find no one there. But in the beam of the light, I saw it. Another orange stake, freshly driven into the dirt, this time only a few feet from my porch. The message was clear. They weren't waiting for the hearing. They were already staking their claim. That was the moment my fear finally broke. I realized then that giving in was precisely what they wanted. Every notice, every fine, every stake in the ground, it was all designed to make me fold. And if I folded, they wouldn't just take my land. They'd take my dignity with it. I wasn't going to let that happen. Because hidden in the paperwork they had so carelessly dismissed, in the deeds they refused to read, was the truth that would turn their entire case to dust. They thought they were pushing out a stubborn homeowner. What they didn't know was that they were trespassing on land that, in every legal sense, belonged to me, and not just the cabin, not just the trees, but far more than they realized. The fight was about to shift, and when it did, the balance of power in the entire neighborhood would collapse in a way they never saw coming. The day of the hearing arrived like the quiet before a storm. I woke early, unable to sleep through the tension that had been building for weeks. Every muscle in my body was tight with anticipation. The cabin, my sanctuary, seemed smaller somehow, weighed down by the knowledge that people who had no right to it were preparing to challenge my ownership. I packed copies of my deed, maps, photographs, and every piece of evidence I had meticulously gathered since the first notice of a petty violation arrived. Each document was a shield, each signature a silent reminder that the law was on my side, even if the HOA hoped I wouldn't realize it. Driving to the county building, I noticed cars parked along the roadside. Neighbors, I assumed, some curious, some perhaps on the HOA's side. The air was crisp, the kind that carries tension in every breath. My chest tightened with every mile. As I walked into the courtroom, the smell of polished wood and paper assaulted my senses. The room was crowded. On one side, the HOA board members sat together whispering to each other and nodding, their faces smug, confident that this time the law would validate their overreach. I took my seat across from them, laying out my documents with careful precision. I had rehearsed my points countless times in the solitude of my cabin, imagining every counter-argument they might make, anticipating every twist they could throw at me. They had power, numbers, and familiarity with the neighborhood. But I had the law, the truth, and the kind of determination that only comes when your home and peace of mind are under siege. The hearing began. The HOA attorney, a stern man with neatly combed hair and eyes like steel, stood and launched into their opening statement. They portrayed me as a trespasser, a defiant homeowner who refused to comply with community rules. They presented photographs, maps, and documents, each meant to make my cabin appear like an intruder in a meticulously ordered world. Their tone was calm, polished, and convincing, but beneath the surface was the arrogance that had fueled their harassment for weeks. When it was my turn, I felt the weight of every glance in the room, but I took a deep breath and began. I laid out my deed, highlighting the property lines, referencing the exact coordinates and measurements that had been legally recorded. I presented the maps, the photographs showing the placement of the cabin, the stakes and the areas the HOA claimed were community land. I methodically countered each claim, quoting statutes, ordinances, and precedents that validated my ownership. I spoke slowly, deliberately, making sure every word landed with clarity and authority. At first, the HOA board seemed unshaken. Their smirks remained, their whispers continued, as if my evidence was inconsequential. But as the minutes passed, the tide began to turn. The more I spoke, the more obvious it became that they had underestimated me. The more I revealed, the more their carefully constructed narrative unraveled. Then came the moment that would change everything. I reached into my folder and pulled out a set of official documents the HOA had never requested, records showing the full extent of my ownership, including the surrounding land that the HOA claimed as community managed. But here was the twist they hadn't anticipated. The deeds also included the properties they themselves occupied. Every single board member's home, every parcel they prided themselves on controlling, had been purchased from my family decades ago, long before the HOA had even been formed. The room went silent. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of the revelation. I laid the documents on the table and addressed the board directly. You have been enforcing rules and issuing fines on property that legally belongs to me. Every action, every threat, every harassment campaign you've waged has been on land that is under my ownership. Gasps filled the room. Some neighbors who had come to watch the spectacle whispered to each other, their faces pale as the reality of the situation sank in. The HOA board's smug confidence faltered. The attorney tried to interject, but the judge raised a hand, signaling silence. The evidence was overwhelming. They had no legal footing, no authority to demand fines, no grounds for eviction. I watched as panic crept across their faces. The same arrogance that had allowed them to harass me so relentlessly now exposed them for the overreaching petty tyrants they truly were. Their whispers turned into frantic muttering, glances exchanged in silent acknowledgement that they had miscalculated. For the first time, they were confronted with the consequences of their own hubris. The judge studied the documents carefully, flipping through the pages with deliberate attention. After what felt like an eternity, he looked up and spoke, his voice steady and firm. Based on the evidence presented, it is clear that the complainant holds legal ownership of the land in question. The HOA has no authority to enforce fines, issue violations, or attempt to evict. Any further harassment or claims will be considered contempt of court. Relief washed over me in a physical wave. My hands unclenched, my shoulders, tight for weeks, finally relaxed. The tension in the room shifted palpably. The HOA board members sat frozen, their mouths open, words failing them. Every document they had used to intimidate me now lay in ruins, shredded by the undeniable truth of ownership. But the climax didn't end there. The court allowed me to speak one final time. I rose, addressing the room, my voice calm but edged with the justice I had fought for. This isn't just about property lines, I said. It's about power, about accountability, about the consequences of overstepping boundaries, both literal and moral. What you tried to do here could have destroyed a home, a life, and a sense of peace that someone has every right to enjoy. Let this serve as a reminder. No authority exists above the law. The board members slumped in their seats. Some avoided eye contact entirely. I could almost feel the collective shame, a subtle vibration of humiliation that only comes when a carefully built facade collapses under undeniable truth. As I gathered my things to leave, I glanced around the courtroom. Neighbors looked at me differently now, not just as the defiant newcomer who had resisted, but as someone who had exposed a system of petty power for what it truly was. There was quiet murmuring, nods of approval, and for the first time, a sense of community that wasn't built on fear, but respect. Walking out of the courtroom, sunlight struck my face in a way that felt almost ceremonial. I had won, not just legally, but morally. Every unfair fine, every trespass, every late-night intimidation attempt had been met with truth and determination. And yet, as I approached my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of their reckoning. The documents I had revealed not only vindicated me, they quietly hinted at the extent of my ownership and influence over the very land the HOA and its members had taken for granted. The realization settled like a quiet storm in my chest. The power dynamics of the entire neighborhood were about to shift, permanently. I drove away from the courthouse with a sense of vindication, but also a simmering anticipation. The battle had been won, but the story, the one that would reshape the neighborhood forever, was only beginning. Returning to the cabin after the courtroom victory, I felt a profound mixture of relief and quiet triumph. The air around my home seemed lighter, almost as if the trees themselves recognized the end of a long siege. For weeks, the cabin had felt more like a battlefield than a retreat, every creak of the floorboards echoing with tension, every glance outside a reminder of eyes that weren't mine watching, judging, and threatening. But now, with the legal confirmation of my ownership in hand, those shadows began to fade. I spent that first evening methodically walking the property, inspecting every corner, every boundary marker, and even the small stakes that had been planted. During the height of the HOA's intimidation, one by one I removed them, stacking them neatly as if dismantling a battlefield. Each stake I pulled from the ground felt like a weight lifted from my shoulders, a silent reclaiming of not just land, but of autonomy. Neighbors began to notice. Some watched from across the street as I went about my tasks, cautiously curious, but no longer sneering or whispering behind closed doors. Others approached, offering tentative nods, small smiles, even brief congratulations. I realized that the victory wasn't only personal, it had sent a ripple through the neighborhood, exposing the overreach and absurdity of the HOA's actions. Where once fear had dictated behavior, now there was a subtle shift toward accountability and respect. Yet even with legal vindication, the aftermath required careful management. The HOA board members, humiliated by the courtroom exposure, tried to save face through passive-aggressive measures. Letters were sent, ostensibly community updates, that were thinly veiled attempts to maintain authority. They wrote about guidelines, inspections, and neighborhood standards, all while knowing their previous tactics had been invalidated. Each envelope arriving in my mailbox was a reminder that while the law had sided with me, human pettiness and stubbornness could linger. I responded carefully, sparingly, and always with documentation. I knew the importance of maintaining both legal and moral high ground. If there were to be any lasting change, it would have to be reinforced not with confrontation, but with clear evidence and the quiet demonstration of rightful ownership. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Their letters became less aggressive, less frequent. The passive-aggressive undertones faded. The threats, once bold and public, turned into silence. They had lost not just in court, but in credibility. The community, too, began to feel the consequences of their board's missteps. Conversations that once whispered fear and compliance started to include questions, debates, and even minor challenges to petty rules. People realized that compliance was voluntary only within the boundaries of reason and legality. The HOA's previous reign of subtle intimidation could no longer stand unchallenged. Where once neighbors had been timid or intimidated, they now observed and evaluated one another. My fight had illuminated a larger truth. Power, when wielded without accountability, can always be questioned. At home, I took time to restore the cabin and its surroundings, not as an act of vanity, but as a symbolic reclaiming of the space. I planted a small garden where the stakes had once marked their false claims, the vibrant greenery growing as both literal and metaphorical proof of renewal. I repaired the mailbox, polished the porch, and stacked firewood neatly, not to comply with rules, but to create an environment of peace and pride. Every action reminded me of the contrast between living under threat and living in freedom. Reflecting on the ordeal, I understood how deeply it had tested me, not just as a homeowner, but as a person. Fear, frustration, and even anger had been constant companions. Yet, the discipline of documenting, preparing, and presenting undeniable proof became its own form of empowerment. I realized that resilience wasn't passive. It was active, deliberate, and often exhausting. But it was also transformative. For weeks after the hearing, I noticed subtle changes in the neighborhood dynamic. HOA board meetings, previously dominated by self-assured, domineering voices, were attended with caution. Residents began asking questions, challenging interpretations, and asserting their rights. The shift was not immediate, nor was it uniform, but it was palpable. My battle had created a precedent, demonstrating that legal authority and moral clarity could outmatch unchecked power. Friends and acquaintances from outside the community reached out after hearing the story. They expressed shock, admiration, even disbelief at the lengths the HOA had gone to intimidate me. Each message was a reminder that the struggle wasn't mine alone. It was emblematic of broader patterns in neighborhood politics everywhere. The victory held lessons for anyone facing unjust authority. Clarity, preparation, and persistence could overturn even the most entrenched assumptions of power. Yet there was also a personal element to the aftermath that I couldn't ignore. Nights became restful again. The subtle anxiety that had plagued me, eyes in the trees, footsteps on gravel, whispered threats, gradually lifted. I could finally walk the property without hesitation, work in the yard without looking over my shoulder, and breathe without the constant tension that had defined my first weeks in the cabin. Even small victories carried weight. When the HOA attempted minor enforcement in the months following the hearing, I responded with calm documentation. Each attempt was neutralized, each overreach countered by evidence and law. The process itself became a demonstration, unchecked. Power can be constrained, not through confrontation alone, but through the unyielding application of truth. And in the quiet moments, I thought about the lessons this ordeal had taught me, that homes are more than structures. They are sanctuaries. Those rules, although sometimes necessary, can be misused and weaponized, and that vigilance, patience, and preparedness are the only shields against those who would abuse authority for personal satisfaction. Finally, I looked at the cabin, at the forest beyond, and realized that the conflict, while intense, had left a permanent mark not of fear, but of empowerment. I had faced a relentless challenge and emerged not only victorious, but also stronger, wiser, and more aware of the nuances of human behavior in close-knit communities. As the sun set over the treetops, casting long shadows across the property, lines, I reflected on one undeniable truth. Justice isn't always loud or immediate. Sometimes it's quiet, methodical, and revealed through patience, preparation, and unwavering resolve. The HOA had learned a lesson they would not forget, and the neighborhood, too, had glimpsed the fragility of unchecked power. I stepped onto the porch, breathing deeply, the cool evening air carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The cabin, finally mine in every sense, felt alive again. The land that had been the stage for weeks of harassment, stress, and uncertainty now held a renewed sense of ownership, peace, and possibility. And as the stars began to appear in the night sky, one thought lingered, influential and enduring. Those who attempt to dominate through fear will always falter when faced with truth and resolve.